Welcome back to All About Winning Daily Fantasy Sports. My name is Ty Patton. Elusive, variance, and unpredictable. The words I think of most when I think of the tight end and defensive special teams positions when building my DFS lineups each week. However, there are fantasy relevant numbers we can use to gain an edge, which in the end is all we are looking for. A common strategy for some DFS players is to punt the tight end and defensive special teams positions and use that salary to spend up for other positions. To each his own, but I am not willing to punt any position. Each position represents 11% of my total winning score, and I want to research every position, and I'm looking for value, whether it's quarterback, tight end, defense special teams, wide receiver. That's how I build my lineups. In this video, I will use fantasy relevant numbers to identify the top tight ends and defense special teams for your main slate lineups tomorrow. Before I unpack Week 12, I want to take a quick look back at Week 11 to show you a small sample of the variance I previously described. Excuse me. In Week 11, these were the top 5 projected tight ends, the top 5 scoring, and the top 5 in ownerships. The top 5 projected were as follows: Darren Waller from Oakland, Andrews from Baltimore, Ertz from Philadelphia, Cook from New Orleans, and Doyle from Indianapolis. The actual top 5 scoring were as follows: Griffin from the Jets, who scored 24.90 fantasy points, Ertz from Philadelphia, who scored 18.40 fantasy points, Rudolph from Minnesota, who scored 17.70 fantasy points, Andrews from Baltimore, who scored 17.50 fantasy points, and DeWilly from San Francisco, who scored 17.40 fantasy points. Ownership broke down as follows for the top 5. Olsen led the way, and this is for a larger GPP tournament ownership, but ownership's generally pretty close across the industry. Excuse me. Olsen led the way, 15.69% ownership. Waller, 12.13% ownership. Cook from New Orleans, 10.47% ownership. DeWilly, 4.43% ownership, and Ertz 4.28% ownership. Only Ertz appears in the top projected scoring and ownership categories. These top tight ends in Week 11 averaged 19.18 fantasy points. They had an average of 6 targets, which breaks down to 3.20 fantasy points per target. Which leads me to Week 12 and the numbers I focus on when breaking down the tight end position. I've developed this chart that you see here on the screen, and for anybody new to the channel, just recap it real quick. Obviously, red is the worst, yellow is mediocre, and green is the best. Now, this is in comparison for each category. Obviously, Ertz isn't a bad tight end. For this particular category, salary, it's the worst if you go down and compare it to someone like Luke Wilson from Seattle, who's 2,500. So it's in comparison for each category. The categories that I have are obviously targets per game right here, fantasy points per game, the opponent's fantasy points per game allowed to the tight end position, their ranking in comparison to the rest of the NFL, and how many red zone targets they've received. And over here, the names, obviously the ones in green are the ones that I'm going to be targeting this week. But I'm going to go over them, excuse me, and break it down for you. And hopefully this information provides some value for you. First up, Ertz, 6,000. He's the top spend up option this week at tight end. He's getting the most targets per game on the main slate. 8.5 targets per game. He's scoring 13.3 fantasy points per game. Seattle's given up 11.3 fantasy points per game to the tight end position, and they rank 26 DVP versus the tight end. And Ertz has received 9 red zone targets. Now, the concern with Ertz is there's another tight end named Goddard. And sometimes Goddard gets the attention. So you have to factor that in as well, and sometimes temper your expectations if teams are going to focus on stopping Ertz, which they might do tomorrow because the news hasn't come out whether or not Alshon Jeffrey is going to be active or not. So if Jeffrey's out, obviously those targets got to go somewhere, and the logical choice would be to Ertz. Seattle's probably going to be well aware of that. They might focus on trying to stop Ertz, which would open things up for Goddard. Those are some things that you have to look at. I do like Ertz tomorrow if I can get up to him. It's a lot of it depends on ownership as well. If everyone's spending down at the tight end position, that's oftentimes when I'll spend up. If they're spending up, that's a lot of times when I'm going to spend down and try to gain leverage that way. Next up is Waller from Oakland. He's 5,700. He's getting 7.2 targets per game, averaging 14.7 fantasy points per game, which is the highest on the main slate. The Jets are number 4 DVP versus the tight end position. They only give up 7.2 fantasy points per game to the tight end position, and he's received 10 red zone targets, more than any other tight end on the main slate. Waller is a huge part of the Oakland passing game, and I believe that it's not going to be a Josh Jacobs game tomorrow because the Jets are really stingy versus the run. They are beat up really bad at the linebacker position. Mosley's been ruled out again, and some other key players. So I think this sets up really nice for both teams for it to be a passing game, and the actual over/under on the game is 45.5. So not too low. It's in the mediocre area. But I do have some interest in this game as a pivot off of the more popular Tampa Bay Atlanta game. So I will have some shares of Waller. If I got to Waller though, I would probably try to figure out a way to get to 300 and go on up to Ertz, and that's how I oftentimes do things when building my lineups. So these are your top 2 options, and these guys are always in play. Next up is Griffin from the Jets. Same game as Waller. He's 4,200, so 1,500 less than Waller and 1,800 less than Ertz. So a nice spin down option. Now it says he's only averaging 3 targets per game. He's scoring 8.1 fantasy points per game. But Oakland's given up 28, or they have a number 28 DVP versus the tight end position, and they're giving up 15 points per game to the tight end, which is the most on this on the main slate. So it's a really good matchup for Griffin, and Darnold has showed in the past couple weeks. Last week he went to him. Griffin actually had 5 receptions, 109 yards, and a touchdown. And the game script for this is similar. Maybe a passing game, and I look for both tight ends in this game to be pretty active. But Darnold does have some, he's got Crowder, he's got Bell, and Robbie Anderson, so he does have a lot of mouths to feed. But this sets up real nice as far as matchup wise for Griffin, and I like the price. I look at ownership. If he's being overlooked, I will definitely go back to him. I don't want to get caught up in FOMO, fear of missing out, but because of what he did last week, he was a leading tight end. But there's good reason to believe that you can go back to Griffin this week as well. Next up is Olsen. And I actually have a lot to say about Olsen. He's 4,100. He's averaging 6 targets per game. He's scoring 10.4 fantasy points per game. New Orleans has a number 9 DVP versus the tight end position, and they're giving up 8.4 fantasy points per game to the tight end. He's had 5 red zone targets, but he has averaged. There's been 4 games that he's played in New Orleans that he's played in dating back to 2014, and this is his average. 5.5 receptions on 8.4 targets. He's averaged 100.5 yards, and he scored 2 total touchdowns. So he's had some really good games in New Orleans. They are going in as a 9.5 point underdog, I believe. Yeah, 9.5 point underdog. The over/under on this game is 48 points. The game script is there for him to a positive game script for Allen to be throwing the ball. Allen's coming off a horrific game last week versus Atlanta. So I really have a lot of interest in Olsen. I like the price, and I like the history. Now, that was probably obviously a lot of games, if not all the games, with Cam Newton. But I still think he's in play here because Kyle Allen has been going to him, and very interesting play for your. And he could possibly go overlooked tomorrow with a lot of attention going to Ertz and Waller. Next up, and I talked about this guy when I was talking about Ertz, is Goddard. He's 3,700. He's averaged 4.2 targets per game. He's scoring 8.1 fantasy points per game. As I previously mentioned, Seattle has a 26 DVP versus the tight end position, and they're giving up 11.3 fantasy points per game to the tight end. He could be the nice pivot off of Ertz if all the ownership's going to Ertz, and for the reasons that I described earlier, if Jeffries is out and the focus is going to be Ertz, Seattle tries to take away Ertz, that could open things up for Goddard. And I did see some things I've mentioned a couple times about Jeffrey being out. I did see a couple things that were leaning towards him playing tomorrow. So if he played, I would temper my expectations with Goddard. But Goddard was the guy that Wentz was going to when they played Dallas, and Wentz will go to both these tight ends, and they are banged up. Deshaun Jackson's out. Even if Jeffries plays, he's still banged up. You don't know if he's going to be limited or if he'll leave the game. If his injury flares up, so keep an eye on that. He's just a really nice sneaky pivot off of more highly owned Ertz. Next is McDonald from Pittsburgh. He's 3,500. I really like McDonald this week. Juju Smith-Schuster's been ruled out. So those targets have to go somewhere. Obviously, some of them will go to Deontay Johnson. McDonald's is averaging 4.7 targets per game, scoring 7.6 fantasy points per game. Cincinnati has a number 18 DVP versus the tight end position, and they give up 10.5 fantasy points per game to the tight end. He's had 9 red zone targets, and I think he is the nice fill-in safety valve for Rudolph tomorrow versus Cincinnati. I think this game is actually going to be competitive. I know they're a 7-point favorite in Cincinnati. This is a division rival. These teams do not like each other. I've mentioned in my other videos, I'm here in Ohio. I'm a Dallas Cowboy fan, but I follow the Bengals closely. This is the Bengals Super Bowl tomorrow. This is the team that they dislike the most. As I mentioned, division rivalry. Everything sets up, and I hope Pittsburgh hasn't overlooked them, because this could be an 0-10 team is dangerous. As silly as that may sound, so I'm not sure they'll win the game, but I think they're going to come out and be competitive. Which, if they're competitive, this would obviously favor McDonald. If it's type of game where they can't really rely on the running game and shortening the game and controlling the ball, Cincinnati is able to put some points on the board, put pressure on them. Rudolph has definitely shown the propensity to go to McDonald, and again, he doesn't have Smith-Schuster tomorrow, so I have a lot of interest in McDonald, especially at that price, 3,500. Doesn't take much to get value at that price. After McDonald is Howard. Now, last week, Braid had the big game for Tampa Bay, and probably a lot of people were going to go right back to him. Howard's a very talented tight end. For some reason, he just, the numbers don't support that. Winston doesn't go to him much. He's only averaging 3.7 targets per game. He averages 6.3 fantasy points per game. This game is the highest total on the board. And I always like to get exposure to the games with the higher totals, whether it be through tight ends, the wide receivers, quarterback. So I'll have some pieces of Howard as part of a game stack or team stack. I like that price a lot. I think recency bias, as I mentioned, forced people to Cameron Brate because of the game he had last week. But I have a lot of interest in Howard in this particular matchup. I think this game's going to have a lot of scoring in it. The total was 53, or that was the opening line total. And Atlanta's defense has played very well the last few weeks, but I don't think that's the true Atlanta defense. I think they might be playing a little bit above their head. And Winston throws the ball all over the place. He averages 40 pass attempts per game, and I could see him getting Howard involved in this game. Last is Eifert. Seems like I have some tight ends from the same. See, I got Ertz and Goddard in the Philadelphia game. Then I got Griffin and Waller. Seems like I got the tight ends from the same games. But Eifert versus Pittsburgh. This is the weakness against Pittsburgh, the middle of the field. They are number 27 DVP versus the tight end position. They're giving up 11.4 fantasy points per game to the tight end. Eifert's averaging 4.2 targets per game. He's averaging 6.3 fantasy points per game. He's had 8 red zone targets. He was on the receiving end of Finley's first touchdown pass when he took over for Dalton. He's definitely a safety valve for Finley. Pittsburgh likes to put a lot of pressure on the quarterback. He might not have time for routes to develop, and he might have to go to Eifert a lot. And they're big home underdogs, so if you believe that's going to come true, then they're going to be playing in comeback mode. And I just can see, PPR and Draftkings, that adds up. And if he doesn't have time, I could see Eifert having a really big day. Even in garbage time, garbage points count just as much as the early points. So I have a lot of interest in him at that price. And he's, again, 3,100. It's not hard to get value at that. And, 100 yards, touchdown, 5 receptions would absolutely smash that value. So definitely have some interest in Eifert. And also, I believe Alden Tate, the other wide receiver, AJ Green's out for Cincinnati, and Alden Tate, which is Green's replacement, I believe he's going to be out. He's doubtful right now. So that leaves Boyd and Erickson, and I believe the other, they might actually be using either Stanley Morgan or the other rookie that they have. So I could see this setting up real nicely for Eifert tomorrow and be sneaky, under-owned. I'm sure he's going to have low ownership. So, it's taken for granted that Cincinnati is going to get mopped up by Pittsburgh tomorrow, but we'll see. So that's the last tight end that I have interest in as far as building my lineups. I do feel like there's a lot of value this week at the tight end position, and as I mentioned, I don't want to give in to FOMO and push to get Ertz in my lineup. If everyone else is doing that, and but if everybody else is taking the stance that I am, and there's a lot of value and spending down, and that ownership is down on Ertz, I will be trying to get up to him as well. So that's where I am with my tight ends this week. Recapping real quick, you can follow along over here in the green. Ertz from Philadelphia, Waller from Oakland, Griffin from the Jets, Olsen from Carolina, Goddard from Philly, McDonald from Pittsburgh, Howard from Tampa Bay, and Eifert from Cincinnati. Okay, now I want to take a look at another position that provides a lot of variance from week to week, and that's the defensive special teams. I don't have a chart developed for you guys to follow along yet. Haven't come up with a way to do that. There's so much variance from week to week with defense special teams. A couple things that I follow that I like to use as just general rules. I like to target the defenses for teams that are projected to win a lot. Because if they're going to be winning a lot, the other team is going to be probably passing a lot to catch up. Which the passing game to me is where the defensive special teams is capable of racking up a lot of fantasy points. It sets up sacks, fumble, interceptions, turning those into touchdowns. Just all kinds of bad things can happen in the passing game, especially passing games where the quarterback might be erratic or Going against a rookie quarterback, I generally try to focus on home favorites, and there's not much variance in the overall scores from top to bottom. There's been a few weeks. I mean, New England had the week where they had 37 fantasy points, and basically, if you didn't have exposure to them that week, you might have been able to cash, but you weren't going to probably win whatever contest you were in. But before we dive into this week's, I want to take a quick look back at last week's defense special teams and just give you an example of the variance, just like I did with the tight ends. The top 5 projected defense special teams last week were the Patriots, 49ers, Bills, Cowboys, and Vikings. The actual top 5 scoring were as follows. The Falcons, who scored 26 fantasy points. Then it drops off to the Saints, who scored 17 fantasy points. Baltimore, who scored 15 fantasy points. 49ers, who scored 14 fantasy points. And the Raiders, who scored 13 fantasy points. The ownership broke down as follows. Pittsburgh led the way with 17.86% ownership. And actually, I shouldn't even have that one in there. I just noticed that Pittsburgh was on the Thursday night game, but they did lead in ownership last week, 17.86% of all of the defense special teams. Arizona was next, and on the main slate would actually have led the way at 9.58%. And if you remember, Arizona was only 1,500, so basically everybody was punting that position. They scored 5 fantasy points and actually outscored some of the higher projected defenses. But they, I mean, that's not hitting value, obviously, but a lot of their ownership was way up there because of that price. That allowed you to get to a lot of the higher priced players last week. Now, next in ownership was New England, who had 7.58%. Oakland, who had 7.50%, and Minnesota 7.07%. 4 of the 5 won their games straight up. The only one that didn't, ironically, was Arizona. Now, as I mentioned, I'm obviously looking for mismatches, which can be perceived in the point spread. And I told you the theory that I like to use, the large favorites, that game theory of having to play catch up and being far behind and having to put the ball in the air. And perhaps it's not the type of pace of game that you want, and it's not the game script that you wanted. You wanted to come in and run the ball, and now you're forced to pass the ball. Also, defenses against rookie quarterbacks have been popular. And another thing that's been popular is defenses against the Miami Dolphins this year. They've surrendered a lot of defense special teams points. So those are some of the things that I look at. And as I said, I don't have a chart for you guys developed. I'm not sure how I could do that other than to just show you sacks and interceptions, and that really wouldn't help as far as coming up with a strategy and correlating, because it's different every week. But these are the defenses that I'm going to target this week, and I'm going to give you the reasons why. Cleveland, they're 3,800. Large home favorite. They're playing Miami, which I just talked about. That's been the popular thing to do this year, is to take the defense versus Miami and play all your skill positions against them. Cleveland is actually my favorite spend-up option. They're at home. They're a large favorite. And Miami does not have a position on offense that they have an edge against Cleveland. So I really like Cleveland. I expect that they'll have a lot of ownership, but I will try to get up to them. If I really like this game, in particular, them coming off that really tough helmet game versus Pittsburgh, and I think that Cleveland's going to come out and probably really put it on Miami with running game and their defense. Next up is the Bears. They're 3,700. They're going to have lower projected ownership. The ownership projected ownership that I seen earlier today, they were pretty low. I guess a lot of people figure if they're at 3,700, they'll just spend up to 3,800 and get to Cleveland. But the Bears are at home versus a rookie quarterback who has a propensity to turn the ball over. That checks all the boxes. Home favorite. This could be, and they've been getting run on a lot, which might not be the best thing going against Saquon Barkley, but their pass defenses, and they like to get pressure on the quarterback, and that could be a really bad thing for Daniel Jones tomorrow. So I'm looking for the Bears to bounce back, and I probably won't take the bait and just jump up to Cleveland. Probably have actually more shares of the Bears than I will the Browns. Next is Buffalo. They're 3,400. They're another home favorite, dominant defense, playing against the backup quarterback. Not favored by a lot, and it's the lowest total on the board of 37 points. So they're favored by 4.5 points at home, and they really match up across the board really well. They're in a playoff push, and I look for it. I believe it's going to be a really low scoring game. I do believe in the game total for that, and I think that they'll be able to shut down Sutton, and I don't think Denver will be able to run the ball on them. So with Allen being forced to throw the ball, I think it's going to put their offense in a tough position playing in Buffalo. Next up is New Orleans. They're 3,300. I love the Saints here at this price. They check all the boxes. Allen coming in on the horrific game last week, and the Saints shut down the run. So if they force Carolina to the air, they do put a lot of pressure on the quarterback as well. And playing in the dome, this could be another long outing for Allen. And I really have a lot of interest. New Orleans is actually one of my favorite defenses this week. A large home favorite. They are the largest. Well, Cleveland is the largest at 10.5, and New Orleans is 9.5 at home. So I really have a lot of interest in the New Orleans defense. Last is Pittsburgh. I'm kind of on the fence with Pittsburgh. They're 4,000. They're most expensive. It's obviously supposed to be a total mismatch for Cincinnati. I talked about this earlier. I wouldn't be surprised if Cincinnati wasn't looking at this as their Super Bowl. 0-10, dangerous team. Pittsburgh's coming in beat up. They're missing people from that suspension due to the helmet ordeal. Juju Smith-Schuster's out. James Conner's out. It just seems too obvious that Pittsburgh would come. I think Pittsburgh will cause problems for Cincinnati on defense. I think Finley will turn the ball over a couple times. But I just feel like they're going to be able to stay in the game. Rudolph hasn't been that great either for Pittsburgh. And Cincinnati playing at home. So I generally don't like to take a defense on the road. But I put Pittsburgh down here. I'll probably have some small shares of them. They're definitely not my favorite. But when you look at it on paper, it just looks like it's just going to be a total mismatch. So summing up, my defense special teams I will be targeting in Week 12 are as follows: Cleveland, the Bears, Buffalo, New Orleans, and Pittsburgh. Some small exposure to Pittsburgh. They are all favorites. I feel that will win at home, except for Pittsburgh. And just remember, there's a lot of variance. Some things you want to talk. You want to implement how you think the game is going to go. Look at the point spread. Is it going to go this way? Are they going to put them behind? Are they going to put them in what kind of quarterback? Is it a rookie quarterback putting them in a bad position on the road? Those type of things. Like the Bears game, rookie quarterback, playing in the mystique of the Chicago Bears at home. All those things. What do they check the boxes for you? And that's how I pick my defenses, and I'm generally in the ballpark and have done very well this year with getting the right defenses, at least having one of the top five. So that's where I am with my defenses. I want to thank you guys for joining me. I really hope that you get some value out of this. Use this chart however you like. Take a screenshot, pause the video, use it, help you out, build your lineups for tomorrow, the defenses, and maybe I'll come up with something for defense special teams. But for now, I just don't have one. And these are, I mean, if you look right across, follow right across green, that catches your eye. Those type of things are easy to follow. I encourage you to post any opinions or comments that you may have below, something that you might like to see with the chart, or added, something that might help out. Feel free. Any opinions or comments, I welcome them. I'll try to answer them, and as I said, I try to get back to everybody as soon as possible. Some of you have reached out, and I like to see your opinions on the way you think things will go. Everybody has a different view, and sometimes that's helpful. If you get tunnel vision and you're stuck looking at something one way, and someone else gives you like, well, what about this? And that can help out. And I encourage you to do it on this channel as well, back and forth. I think a few of you have already done that. If you guys would please share this video, like it, subscribe if you're not already a subscriber, and hit that notification bell. It really helps me out. My subscriptions have been trending upwards, which is a good thing, slowly, but they're going up, and my views have been going up. So I really appreciate your time, and I appreciate you guys following me. It helps me out a lot. You can also follow me on Twitter at winningabout, which has been running across the bottom of the screen here. So now it's time to put all this research together, from the quarterback, running back, wide receiver, and this video. Time to put it all together and build some manual and optimized lineups, which I will be doing in my next video. I'll be posting that here shortly. Thanks again for joining me. I'll see you real soon, and good luck.